One of the most important things about the conduct of pragmatic trials is that it should be rigorous. There's a common misconception, I think, that explanatory trials need to be conducted rigorously, but pragmatic trials, somehow, we don't need so much rigour. And that's emphatically not the case. But the way we conduct the trials is slightly different. So there are a number of things like, for example, randomisation, the way that data is handled, using robust analysis, sort of things like that. Well, they're no different really in explanatory and pragmatic trials, but there are a number of things which need to be handled differently, and I think the key is that what we need to do is to think through the principles very clearly and think those through for the particular trial that we're involved in, because we cannot use some of the standard techniques that you can use in explanatory trials. So I think there needs to be thought and there needs to be rigour. So just to give a few examples, one of the things that we handle differently in explanatory and pragmatic trials is adherence. So in explanatory trials we need people to adhere to the intervention so that it's clear that we're answering the research question that we want to answer. For explanatory trials, we allow non-adherence because these are trials where we want to find out what's going on in the real world, and non-adherence will happen in the real world. But we may want to ask questions, and it usually is important to ask questions such as how much non-adherence is there? What kind of effect has this had on the results of the trial? And it's perfectly legitimate to ask those questions, but we need different sorts of processes and techniques in order to answer those questions. So those need to be thought through. Blinding is also another area which is handled differently in intervention and control, not in intervention and control, in explanatory and pragmatic trials. So in explanatory trials you would often use placebos to blind. In pragmatic trials you can't do the same sort of thing. But that doesn't mean that you should just accept bias in your trial. You need to think through what might be causing bias. Is it serious bias? What sort of effect might it have? Can I do anything to prevent the bias? And sometimes you can have very creative solutions to preventing bias. So it doesn't mean that the trial is not rigorous, but you have to think through how you're going to make sure that it's rigorous. So another major area, particularly for non-drug trials, is in the rigour of the intervention itself. In drug trials, you've got this very long established development process that drugs go through to make sure there's efficacy, to make sure there's safety before they get out, before they're licensed for use in the real world. You need the same kind of development for interventions that are not drugs, but it needs to be done in slightly different sort of way. So, for example, the UK Medical Research Council have a framework for developing and evaluating complex interventions, and that's really useful for understanding the steps that you can go through to develop interventions. One of the other issues that's handled differently in explanatory and pragmatic trials is the recruitment of participants, because in pragmatic trials you really want the participants to be representative of the population that you eventually want your intervention to apply to. So actually it's key in these trials to try and get that representativeness, which you don't have to struggle so hard with or not so concerned about in explanatory trials. So finding ways of making sure your inclusion criteria and your recruitment processes really enable you to have a representative sample of patients is really important as well. So that just gives some examples of some of the things that you have to think about very carefully in these trials. There are obviously lots of others. So I would say, though, the most important thing is rigour.